So hey anime fans. The series name is What If Naruto Got Harem with Star Wars? So let's start the series. With his lightsaber blazing midnight blue and burning through the creature's throat, the second headmaster yelled, "Get down," as he leaped over the young Padawan. Padawan Itama hit the ground and rolled just in time to avoid being beheaded by another of the miserable beasts while he used his lightsaber to fight 3 more monsters. Then the second headmaster seized the thing that wielded force. The fact that they all felt like the sticky tar of darkness, and that any attempt to utilize normal telekinesis or mind tricks tended to slip away like oil separating from water, was even more disturbing than the fact that it was almost hard to acquire a firm hold on any of them in the force. The idea of any clones having the same signature was simply unthinkable. The many hundred animals that were swarming the settlement streets all had the same force signature, despite their similar white-green appearance, which surely sparked theories of immoral cloning and genetic experiments between a humanoid civilization and some awful plant life. But it was obviously happening, and it meant the second headmaster was missing something. A secondary force thread grabbed the teen's attacker, the opponents of second headmaster, and all creatures within a 30-meter radius, slamming them all together like garbage into a black hole. Taking advantage of their shocked state, the second headmaster quickly used increasing assaults to decapitate them before turning to confront the oncoming steps. "Master!" Itama exclaimed suddenly. Itama trotted up to meet his Jedi master, shaking sand from his tunics absently. When the relatively small red-haired man reached up and briefly rested a steady palm on the youngster's dual-colored hair, the toddler seemed to be extremely relieved. The second headmaster said, "Knight Akana," and nodded. "Knight second headmaster," the telekinetic replied gently, his gray-brown eyes wandering back to examine his Padawan. Since the two had been separated for over an hour when the most recent revival began, they were all lucky that the man's lips tipped down slightly at the numerous wounds. Fighting inside a civilian city wasn't the worst battlefield for a Padawan like Itama who wasn't being trained to specialize in warfare, but it was generally dangerous for both Jedi and non-combatants because of the small streets, odd layouts, and lots of places where enemies could hide or set up ambushes. Furthermore, you run the risk of being attacked through walls or, worse, having buildings dropped on your head due to subpar construction. But Salk's block-lone, fortified buildings, and wide avenues with few lanes made it harder for the monsters to approach covertly or corner them. "Where have you been, Master Sandman?" Itama asked, looking uneasily at the floating bodies. Akana's left hand shifted slightly, letting the animal parts drop to the ground. "I was delayed by a larger force that appeared from the ground in the northwest quadrant," he added, drawing the attention of the second headmaster. Then he headed northeast toward the center, accompanied by a Padawan. "Once you relayed that you were accompanied by another group of Jedi, I recruited further support and ensured they were aware of the situation we face here," he said. However, the second headmaster remarked, hastily shutting his eyes to confirm that the force's sole ongoing fights were currently taking place in other districts. He followed the two with a red-eyed stare and inquired, "When you say appeared, did they surface from the ground itself or suddenly appear without warning?" The storm shielding was still in place and the majority of the buildings were surrounded by a quiet buzz of electricity due to Selk's evacuation preparations, but this did not justify carelessness. "Both," responded Akana. "Several of the knights personally witnessed them rising as if made of earth, but leaving behind no visible change to the ground except for a lingering miasma of ill feeling in the soil. Another Padawan had her back to a concrete wall, and even with 365 degrees of sight, she was nearly disemboweled when it appeared right next to her." The second headmaster reiterated, frowning at the idea, any technology that could have done this would have had to be specifically made to withstand their eyes, because a Hyuga couldn't see it coming, because their eyes could detect infrared and a much wider spectrum of light than other humanoids. Humanoids had remarkable vision, and when combined with force abilities and the increased adrenaline of combat, it was almost impossible to approach them unprepared. This was not likely to happen. "Does that mean, Master, that it's probably an unnamed force technique?" Itama remarked, tensing his grip on his weapon. Even though the Order had been well educated, the creatures were already incredibly dangerous, swift, and unlike any humanoid the Jedi had studied. That would be the worst option, yes, the second headmaster pondered as he and the other knight exchanged a secret glance. They had a collective consciousness, or hive mind, and once a trick was used, they were all aware of it, despite their seeming lack of awareness. As they gained knowledge, cunning, traps, and outwitting them lost their effectiveness, thus, combining force talents with. As Itama's worry increased, the second headmaster changed the subject and said, "What reinforcements did you acquire?" The younger Senju and his master shouldn't have been on this battlefield, but they were there by chance when the initial attack occurred, and there wasn't enough time for them to be sent out because of the lack of dormancy. Many other Jedi would have died before they could even alert the temple to the attack, and the first headmaster would have probably described Knight Hakana's ability to defeat many attackers despite his academic prowess as a rare gift from the Force. They had to dodge heavy crates that had been left behind near a store after yesterday's evacuation, so the knight quickly turned left through a large aperture in a smaller building to take a shortcut to the next street. "A merchant who happened to be nearby," said the man. The man was not sneered at by the second headmaster. However, the idea of employing a traitor in a battle zone caused him to nod, a merchant, with a hint of rage before he vented to the Force. "More like a jack of all trades." "Mr. the Clone Man has returned, then?" It was hardly the student's fault that his teacher had gone completely insane, Itama replied, perking up a little before fading when the second headmaster's anger rose back up in the Force. With a hint of real anger, the redhead replied, "Yes, it appears that he arrived 2 hours ago." After narrowing his eyes, the second headmaster went on, "We closed all ports close to this city due to the last 37 hours of sporadic attacks. There were only so many ways to use telekinesis to kill," but the second headmaster frowned at the graphic scene that was staged in front of the 14-year-old next to them. The youngster simply shuddered and approached his master, who looked back without mentioning Itama's reaction. The knight replied, "The brat took it as a challenge, swiping out to the left to seize 3 adversaries before whipping them into the ground quickly enough to kill them in a crunch of bone and flesh." Itama eventually said, "Mr. I guess Clone Dude is a friend. Master Sandman only met him once or twice before I became a Padawan, and he rarely appeared." "Well, maybe quite a bit more frequently than not?" Unsure of how to respond to Sandman Akana's apparent rude and irresponsible lack of professionalism, the second headmaster remarked, "You take him on missions." Sandman Akana was very careful in her preparation and planning. The knight was actually chuckling, "He is an adult, and he simply shows up. I take the brat nowhere. He's highly force sensitive. I'm nearly positive that he's close to my level of strength and raw power. His awareness of minute details concerning things that catch his attention is also impressive. He meets us in transit sometimes, so it's not like someone's telling him where we're going or anything, although I think he actually tracks down Master Sandman rather than me because he never finds me first if we're in different places," Itama said as they darted across one of the rare crystal parks, despite the water gushing up from a broken fountain. "Additionally, to my great misfortune," Akana continued. Padawan Itama chuckled uncontrollably behind his teacher's back and murmured, "They're friends, they like to fight." If he had been willing to close his eyes in this circumstance, he would have been inclined to pinch the bridge of his nose, but he persisted. "That hardly changes the fact that there's no benefit to having an untrained civilian here," he said. "Force potential means nothing if not trained," he stated. "A face without a lid or a half, while the fool may often fail to prepare sufficiently enough, he's acceptably capable, certainly more preferable than the numerous other sentients that we cannot evacuate and who you'd prefer not being here." "And his skills?" asked the second headmaster, raising an eyebrow. Despite the child's sudden and unexplained anxiety, Akana didn't seem inclined to answer, save to tip his head slightly in the direction they were going. At least his Padawan was more courteous. "He's well," the child said before vanishing. In the north-central region bordering the scrublands, the second headmaster began to run away when he heard a distant rumbling explosion close to the spaceport. Additional smaller, strangely frequent explosions quickly followed. He reasoned that since some small explosives, blasters, and projectile weapons don't make the right sound, there might have been some waiting to be transported in the spaceport. If the monsters had reappeared there, one of the others might have used the stock to help control the populace. Itama laughed quietly from where he and Akana were trailing him, and the youngster said, "He's a little explosive?" "That's your merchant," the second headmaster shouted as they rushed. The knight glared at him and replied, "I don't take responsibility for the brat, but there's a reason he hasn't killed himself sneaking around my missions." "Not the subtlest person in a fight though," Itama said. "Using explosives is illegal on most worlds and damages property, which attracts attention from others," he yelled as they finally reached the city's center plaza and headed north to face the spaceport. "Well, to be fair, Mr. Clone Man doesn't really blow things up without a purpose, or, in areas where it's too troublesome to avoid getting arrested, and Master Sandman's already informed him that was the last time we were bailing him out." The second headmaster looked away from them, pondering. "Is this correct?" "He only got caught because I made a mistake, and he spared us a month of time and a run-in with the Huts," Itama vehemently objected, saying, "It wouldn't have been right to leave him there like that, and he did deserve it," after he seemed to notice the tone of his previous statement. Akana's flatter-than-normal appearance implied that he would have been more than happy to leave the brat behind to deal with the fallout, because his Padawan's uneasiness over the issue probably encouraged the merchant to keep showing up. Second head, Master. Master Mito, the red-haired Jedi, called out from the spaceport entrance. "How is the situation here?" he said. "Nothing was detected in the south-central or west-central quadrant, therefore we've cleared the southwest quadrant for the time being," he said. "It's under control," she responded, extending a warm greeting to Akana and waving them in. "We had a few mass swarms suddenly manifest out of the tarmac in the landing areas outside, but some unusual help allowed us to deal with them quickly wholesale before they spread out further," she continued, beaming at Itama. Dryly asked, "The previous explosions?" "Not exactly our normal methods," she responded with a grin, "but it's quite fortunate this time. We only have 7 Jedi on the ground right now. Without being able to identify how the creatures are arriving and stop them, we simply don't have the ability to cover the entire city with these few people." "Do we know anything about them?" Akana said after glancing at him. "What we have here is better than anything in my network," he replied. "No," replied Mito, "Knight Ebisu and his student have been unable to find anything that remotely matches so far in the archives on Coruscant, and the Corellian archives are younger. It's unlikely they have it, but we've asked another team to search there as well. At this point, we're referring to them as drones because of the apparent collective mind." He explained that the second headmaster had modified his plans as far as could to account for the small number of warriors. "I was advised that another 13 Jedi at minimum were en route to help control this," he continued. "Why haven't the other backup squads arrived?" "There's a large ion storm going on that started engulfing the main hyperlane route nearby this planet. Anyone who didn't manage to get in ahead of it is having to divert to avoid it. It's adding on to the travel time, so the next arrival won't make it for a minimum of 9 hours, and they'll be staggered coming in," stated Mito. "They might be able to sleep in turns because the attacks had a regular timing pattern, but they had started 2 days earlier, and every Jedi in the room had been at work for at least 15 hours. Akana would have fallen asleep from exhaustion from surviving the first 10 hours with only his Padawan, and then the rest if his attack style hadn't been so physically basic. The knight was probably hiding a migraine from extreme force overuse, made worse by the focus required for his work. In addition, none of the Jedi dossiers he had read prior to this mission indicated any species whose circadian cycle was meant to continue more than 31 hours. "Do we know how to kill them?" Akana confirmed that mass trauma also incapacitates them, despite the fact that they are extremely durable and can eventually sprout new limbs. "Well, you can always blow them up," the voice input remarked happily. A young blonde man with long hair covering his left eye, dressed like a spacefarer, approached them and casually tossed a small cylinder up and down. He had an open messenger bag hanging from his left hip, which made the second headmaster suspicious, and an unusually active force signature for someone who was supposed to be completely untrained. "Hello, Mr. Clone Man," Itama said. "Hey kid, nice to see you haven't gotten yourself gutted, stabbed, blown up, or kidnapped to be a paramour to some sick old freak with control issues and bad hygiene, Itama groaned quietly and covered his face with one palm as Mito and the second headmaster arched their brows at the student-teacher pairing. Did you hire a professional to make that crossbow, or did you do it yourself? Akana said, ignoring them both. I am absolutely capable of making my own supplies, Sanmen no Dana. There is not a flawed part in this entire get-up this time. I checked it twice like you showed me, and besides, the clone man responded with a sneer, the bow is just the delivery system, Itama looked at them both a little anxiously as the second headmaster tried to determine what planetary tongue Dana might be from and whether he had heard that accent before. However, when the blonde gestured for him, Itama slid over and argued silently while the man started packing him full of what appeared to be tiny birds. Mito, however, turned and looked at Akana, who looked back at her, both arms crossed but fingers free. Not saying it's not, kid, but that lightsaber is short range and you're not a natural with it. Take them and try not getting killed. Funerals are boring even if Jedi ones are mildly artistic, and Dana will be totally bitchy to deal with if you kick it, There's nothing artistic about any funeral service, you ill-educated Philistine, Akana continued, squinting into her eyes. You set people on fire. Your predilection for arson doesn't give it artistic flair. It's the ambience and the symbology that makes it art, even if it still sucks as art and could be improved by Blowing up bodies isn't suitable, nor is it art in any Mito cut in, lifting her eyebrows and glancing at the two men. If we could kindly stay on the pertinent topic we're currently concerned with, that would be appreciated, she continued. You see, Itama avoided the clone man's distracted slap to the skull by mouthing at the second skull master. I told you they enjoy arguing. It was shocking when the second headmaster apparently acknowledged that Akana lacked the physiological capacity to react significantly to anything because the first headmaster had already bet Mito a lot of Naboo goodies. Mito's words, "come along," were a subliminal order with the power of an established Jedi master. I have a droid working on an accurate city map to mark the points where they've appeared and when, and it should be finished consolidating all the available data from the last few days, Mito said. The clone man followed Akana's lead and queried inquisitively, and if it's random, You'll find that very little in life is truly random, Mr. Clone Man, so long as you've got the mind to see the hidden patterns, Mito said, looking out toward a parked spacecraft. And I'm quite interested in finding who made this particular pattern, Mito said. Again, the second headmaster spoke sharply. Who? Master Mito said, call it a feeling, with a clear humming. In contrast to the rare Jedi who were trained later in life, second headmaster and other foundlings had practically been raised with the current Jedi Order code from birth, regardless of their opinions. Despite his own emotional instability and occasional haughtiness, second headmaster had always made an effort to protect the code, which was an integral part of their identity. There was, after all, a great deal of wisdom in the code. There is no passion, no chaos, harmony, no death, no feeling, peace, ignorance, knowledge, and the Force. Of course, there was also the less formal advice of the older Jedi: anger leads to hate, fear leads to the dark side, and hate leads to pain. Jedi wisely avoided or dealt with all of these emotions during meditation and daily life. However, the second headmaster detested deserts. It could have been more intense than he should have allowed it to be, but he had made every effort to control the constant annoyance that specific environment had aroused. It was more absurd than the ferocious feeling that Jedi everywhere cautioned against, since even Jedi were prone to the excessive discourse that characterized so many sentient species. It was impossible to ignore the existence of a problem once you had a good group of other Jedi who were willing to perform paperwork acrobatics or even grovel to the Council if necessary to save you from being paired with them on another desert assignment. The woman had been a true Twi'lek and a genius herself, and even in the face of subtle or overtly prejudiced remarks that had made a teenage second headmaster bite his tongue to keep quiet, she had only ever approached frazzled when he and a desert were together, according to second headmaster. In other words, the longer he was forced to live in a desert, the more irascible, aggressive, irritable, and sharp-tongued he became. Apparently, dealing with a teenage boy human who had to drown in sunscreen to avoid broiling and who soon turned into a knife-sharp, grumpy, pathological truth-teller who didn't care how many blasters were armed and in the room made it harder to balance the heat, diplomacy, fellow sentients' egos, and the potential danger. Although he couldn't exactly disagree with her, the second headmaster never made fun of his master's emotional memories of how much more diplomacy she had learnt during his teaching years compared to the rest of her career. To the dismay of all their friends and old creche colleagues, the original headmaster had always thought the whole thing was funny. Even though he was officially leading the task team on dealing with this threat, second headmaster was clearly unenthusiastic from the moment he saw the destination on the mission brief, since all the Jedi on this mission had previously worked with him on previous non-desert operations, and few Jedi were willing to act out in front of such a respected master, and because Mito had a way of calmly inspiring people with her skills, competence, and manners. While he still didn't understand why the older woman paid attention to his self-proclaimed brother, second headmaster always found her to be quite pleasant and peaceful. Even after they had landed, the second headmaster remained hopeful that they would accomplish their goal because there were so many skilled and talented Jedi aboard, and if luck and the Force were on their side, they would find out what was going on with as few innocent casualties as possible and hopefully without any personal deaths. They would not be lucky this time, which was regrettable. Alright, everyone, notably, Clone Man had joined them rather than the observers, reserving the space on the other side of Akana from Padawan Itama and smiling amiably at Knight Kamazuki's sidelong glance. Mito yelled calmly, ignoring the city and government officials hovering uncertainly to her left. All of the big fish who had come to meet the Jedi, as well as the citizens who had been at the spaceport or worked there when the evacuation order was issued, could see them, but it was safer to gather inside the shielded hangar of the local spaceport after the other knights had returned from their various parts of the city, as shields would prevent any surprise attacks if the drones broke pattern. As the local mayor had asked him and Mito to revoke that order as soon as they landed, Knight Hakana had logically demanded that the local tunnels connecting the underground city structures be shielded off as well, even though it was customary to leave them open when the shields went up for a storm lockdown, and the second headmaster had not taken much pleasure in providing a concise explanation of why they would not be doing so, since they were not aware of the limits of the drone's ability to appear in different places. This had led to widespread ire in Selk. It was amusing to all the Jedi in attendance who had witnessed Mito fight during demonstrations before, and he took some small pleasure in the fact that all the officials now avoided him, as Mito appeared to be safer than him. Master Mito nodded to the small robot behind her, which beeped and produced a hologram, rapidly zooming in on an aerial view of Selk from the planetary image of Samaria, superimposing a distinct grid over the city. Given the information provided by Knight Akana and the Sumerian government, you are all aware that the attacks have been ongoing for roughly 38 hours now, with periodic breaks ranging from 5 to 8 hours. However, by utilizing satellite-based technology to better document the locations for each attack, we've discovered that this is incorrect. Larger dazzling blue circles and tiny, individual red pins soon blanketed the city's display. Each blue circle encompasses a group of drones that manifested together. As you can see, they're concentrated wholly into the western and central quadrants, with the south-central having nearly no attacks and the northwest quadrant having 1.5 times as many manifestations as any other quadrant. Following that logic, I had our 3-78 expand the map into the northwest scrublands to determine how large the radius was for these creatures. With the map spanning several dozen kilometers and almost twice as many appearances, nearly 60% of them centered on a sunken crater just beyond the desert, Knight Higgins softly whistled. All of these have occurred starting 110 hours ago, but had gone unnoticed and unreported up to now, Mito remarked, glaring down at a well-dressed Sumerian in the neighborhood who courageously refused to take back her gentle criticism. Master Jedi, Jedis, we were unable to notify you of the accurate information regarding the situation since the surveillance you were granted access to does not report to a local level like our city government, he shouted behind his haughty exterior. Knight Ao asked, raising an eyebrow over his patch as he turned his remaining purple eye to the civilians, you're saying that you just overlooked the widespread appearance of homicidal and bizarre nonsense outside your borders? His Padawan seemed to be torn between caring for a shallow wound she was bandaging on her master's arm and annoying the civilians with her own identical eyes. Hagane's momentary sputter was interrupted by a snort from one of the security guards behind him. He complained, looking back with a split lip and crossed arms as they all turned to face him. Of course not a single native Sumerian heir heads that way and all the roads and pathways head out towards the east and south, ain't no reason we'd have seen him, he said. To his right, behind their goggles and rebreathers, Knights Gozu and Meizu exchanged a silent message before slyly signing at AO with a flash of tea rose and tangerine-colored fingers. The second headmaster narrowed his red eyes at the almost palpable anxiety that pervaded the majority of the spaceport's inhabitants, and he inquired, "Isn't a path straight north the most efficient way to reach the subregion's capital?" Years later, his master's acceptance of the secret interior design task still infuriated the second headmaster. "Well, yeah," the man laughed, "but you're not gonna get anyone willing to go that way. It's bad luck. Better to swing east a bit and then head north." What sort of bad luck is this? After the elder knight verified that the other knights were watching and the second headmaster obscured the official's view, AO used a more colloquial dialect to state that anything in that area felt and looked strange to the Hyuga and Kel door pairs, respectively. Mito said calmly as AO's gaze shifted to the second headmaster. "The lethal kind," he remarked dryly. "It's just superstitious," another official pointed at the Jedi with a tense hand and made an assertive statement while sneering firmly and dismissively. "Not when it's got a body count, it ain't." "How long has this period of bad luck continued?" the second headmaster asked bluntly before pride or shame could hide the truth in an attempt to keep their dignity. "Always, sir," replied another security officer courteously. "The town's quite a few centuries old at this point, but that area has been trouble since the very beginning. People don't come back sometimes or they come back strange. I can't quite describe it, but it's just not right over there, and it's more so the closer you are to that hole in the ground." "That part's more recent, though," shouted the nice man beside him over his shoulder. "The area is the same, but the ground there caved in approximately." "Hello, Jarek. When did that fucking hole open up?" asked the nice man next to him, holding his nose in pain. The second man struck the first on the arm and saw him with his hand still covering his face. "I think it was about 6 years ago, perhaps, Master Jedis," he said. "Why was that done?" The second headmaster ignored the whispered remarks about proper behavior when he replied, 6 years, rationalizing that it seems unlikely to be related directly to this incident with that kind of time gap, but the location is a definite concern. "We could divide in half, leave one group here and send in the other to investigate at the beginning of the next 5-hour gap," said Kamizuki. "It would give the group more time to explore unimpeded while safely escaping before they linger long enough to get outnumbered." "We might well use that method, but we have 2 major problems," Mito said with a frown. She tapped the droid lightly once, and the indicators on the map vanished and then returned one after the other in a loop. The second headmaster's frown deepened as the time-lapse went on, and he realized that Padawan Himawari's unusual use of profanity had been noted by the others. "As you can see," Mito continued, "there is no 5-hour gap. While it is true that the town goes a minimum of 5 hours without attack, the creatures are appearing for a duration of 1 hour every 3 hours. They simply skip the town every other repetition while continuing to appear at the sinkhole." "So our window's smaller than expected," AO replied. The hologram stopped on the current time image, revealing a sinkhole that was nearly completely blacked out due to the red pins covering it. "True, but it's not the problem I'm concerned with," the second headmaster said, adding, "After all, the town is free of drones because we've been steadily killing them as they appeared. The depression has been under their focus for more than 4 days with no interference." Although it was regrettable that they had to have this conversation in public, the authorities had created such a stir that it had not been worth the time to take them out. Even Itama, who is unquestionably the kindest person here, was offended by the lack of faith in them. "Fucking shit," said the previous soldier in the background. Mito and the second headmaster looked at each other flatly as the grumbling and fear of the villagers roared in the background. Despite the fact that the numerous issues made it seem like a bit of a mess. "Do we have the luxury of waiting until the other Jedi arrive, Master Mito, Knight's second headmaster?" Gozu mumbled gravelly through his mask. "If we wait longer, their numbers merely increase," he asked. Master Mito looked to the second headmaster, who nodded before turning to address the others, his head tilted slightly in invitation. "Given the staggered arrival times of the reinforcements and how long until the next, I don't believe we should wait. If their rate of growth holds steady, they'll be unmanageable by the last arrival. Even at the most optimistic projections, there's also the possibility that they might achieve whatever their goal is at the sinkhole before then and lose interest. With his hand half hidden by his sleeve, the second headmaster signed what he could, suggesting that the town would lose those figures. And if they turn those numbers against us in this urban battleground, we've already lost, he believed. According to the others, they decided not to reveal the unspoken decision to the public. What we need to do at this point is look at the available information on the specific area as quickly as possible and formulate a plan of action that will confront the drones in more manageable numbers. The sinkhole is in desert area rather than the shrublands nearby, which makes for treacherous footing at the best of times. They all stopped to think over the situation before Akana closed her eyes and sighed. The redhead ignored the hologram and added, "Assume you have immunity for participating in a Jedi mission on behalf of the people. How many explosives exactly do you have stowed on your ship?" The blonde gave a low, deep laugh, then a toothy, eerie smile. "Dana, I always have enough supplies to make my art as big and impactful as I want, To say that it made an impact would be an understatement. Their crew would have benefited even more from being permitted to approach the sinkhole rather than sitting far away and waiting for the concussive blasts to end. The clone man's bombs caused too much damage for something that could pass security. They tore through the masses of drones one after another, leaving bloody pieces of white-green flesh and other parts scattered throughout the kilometer-wide chasm and a brutally noisy parody of dominoes falling in the wake of the manned spacecraft. Meizu laughed and pointed an orange finger at the roaring destruction. "Your boy toy has some nice tricks, Akana," he murmured, leaning his goggled head toward the redhead. The Keldor Knight crouched behind their sand dune, and Akana turned his head gently to face him. His expression was so flat and rejected that it seemed as if Meizu had just proposed that he have sex with a Hutt. The other man burst out laughing. Gozu simply shook his twin's shoulder and hung his head, then grabbed Meizu's hood and yanked it up over his orange head to drive the laughing knight into the sand face first. "My apologies, Akana," Gozu said. "We've been on assignment in the Outer Rim too long and all his behavioral training's gone to the dogs. He's even forgotten how to roll over and beg." "That's not what she said," Meizu sneered, causing Hagain, the second headmaster's right, to snicker. "Of course it's not," Akana replied. "For her to say anything would require that a woman not avoid your very presence." Kamizuki, the second headmaster, stubbornly disregarded the fact that Meizu's brother's weight was holding him with an elbow between the shoulder blades, preventing him from leaping to his feet in offense. Kamizuki whispered, "I'm thinking of drowning them in the sand dune." "Well, you could do that, yeah," replied Kamizuki, removing his brown locks from the bracelet, "but it looks like the bombs are starting to trail off and there's still an awful lot of those things down there. Might as well keep them around to help until Master Mito can look at the cleared area and fix whatever's wrong." With a broad smile, Hagain pointed with his green tattoo. "Besides, there's a handy sinkhole just there. When we're finished, you can always cram them into it," he added. Meizu shot back, pulling his brother away from him. "Take off your wraps and go fondle some lingerie, you kiffer bastard. If I go in, I'm dragging you with me," he said. Akana frowned at the settling blasts and said, "It's hard to feel through the ambient darkness, but I think the bombs have further destabilized the area. At this pace, we might all get dragged in," she said, describing the sensation of the pit's walls collapsing inward. "All right," the second headmaster replied with his lightsaber off. "Everyone keep a distance from the pit itself. They don't seem to have issues with the footing and we don't need to give them any advantages if it gives way beneath us. Knights Gozu and Meizu, Knights Hagain and Kamizuki, your two teams, and Akana will work with me. There's no real advantage for us in cover or approaching unawares, but keep in mind their ability to materialize from the ground. We can't be certain that they only do it on the timed patterns. If this is their real goal, they might call reinforcements." As the fight was ready to start, the second headmaster turned to the others. "According to our 3-78, blasters have a 40% chance of hitting them, but the suppressive fire will allow us to board if needed. Clone Man has promised to stay in the air and out of attack range, but if we have to leave, we must find a large enough open region where he can lower the ship. Work with your partner, don't get separated, and try to keep an opening at your back in case you need to retreat," he said, shaking hands and bowing his head. May the Force be with us. May the Force be with us, the others replied, bowing back. Then it began. The 2 green, 2 light blue, 1 dark blue, and a stationary bird orange that were held straight up had to be Sandmen because of the whirlwind of whitish bodies being thrown into the air without anyone touching them. From an aerial view, the most noticeable thing was the neon gleam of the lightsabers leaving afterimages as they blazed through the twilight landscape, chopping apart their opponents in twisting dances across desert sand. Clone Man whistled softly at the fast-moving Jedi on the display feed, saying, "Would you look at that, Un? You know, I keep saying that Dan is a work of art himself, and he still doesn't get it, but look at this, he's like a human storm, a motionless, blazing center surrounded by absolute chaos and unpredictability, there with no warning and gone with no sign it happened but the wreckage left behind, just a brief instance of skill and power which can never really be captured for future generations, truly a transitory masterpiece, and so ironic given that Dana thinks anything that doesn't last has no value as art, Un. Mr. How perceptive, clone. Maybe you could focus on explaining what's going on for those of us who don't have ringside seats." Master Mito's voice was as dry as the planet Diesis via the comms. He flipped switches and carefully raised the ship just enough to redisplay all 6 fighters before asking, "Un, is your cool satellite footage not working?" "There have been complications," she said in a sophisticated manner. Jedi Mito compared her to a polite rendition of the female Mandalorian mercenary he had met in a club, and the clone man shuddered. "Well, so far I've made an entrance and dealt with most of them from the air. Your fellow Jedi seem slightly jealous, though, because they're hard at work to even out the kill count. No sign that I can see that they're popping up more of the weeds around, but the sinkhole got wider under the stress, Un. So far, are there any signs of potential causes?" she asked. "And how can I be certain of that? Luckily, I never had Jedi training. If you want to explain the magical things, I can go straight down and take that white-haired mansicle, or, if you prefer, Dana, who is skilled at picking up on the subtle pulling of strands," the clone man asked, laughing as he leaned back in his chair and extended his hands to his audience in the distance. "Are we not still engaged in combat? That really is, what the heck?" "What is it?" the Jedi said authoritatively. The clone person said, "They're moving, Un," as he peered at the screen and enlarged it. The grim question then surfaced, in the direction of the town? At one point, some of the monsters even approached the Jedi to try to kill them, but the majority were either fleeing the crater or rushing away from it. "No, they're just moving away from the sinkhole, like rats abandoning a ship, Un," he replied, frowning at the image. "I don't know, Master Mito," the sardonic clone man said, quickly accelerating the spacecraft to raise it higher and away from the buried land. "I feel bad about this, Un," he murmured. In order to stop the drone from escaping, the second headmaster swiftly severed its head, threw it to the ground, kicked backwards into another to land on top of it, smashed its skull with a reinforced elbow, rolled back up, and obstructed its flight route. 7 more had passed him in those few seconds. Akana seized every person in his path, hurled them back in front of the second headmaster, and then hurried to another group to get away from both of them. "They've stopped focusing on us," the telekinetic mumbled with half-open eyes before sprinting out to follow their foes. The knight had been a great long-distance support when the second headmaster had flown around him earlier, but the drone's altered behavior was making things intolerable. Hagain shouted, "Oi," from a quarter of a mile around the sinkhole. "What's the plan now?" he inquired, as he and Kamazuki continued to weave in and out of the escaping army. "Take care not to allow them to enter the town," he continued. "There are no settlements in the other directions." His lightsaber had shifted from the focus position held in front of his chest to stabbing forward forcefully like a scorpion's tail. He was okay, but it seemed that he was finally becoming fatigued. He leaped backward to catch Akana in his peripheral vision before firing another drone. "I dislike it when something flees with no apparent cause," Akana said plainly. "It has yet to turn out well." The second headmaster concurred that we need to move further back to match where the others are heading. We can catch more running in that direction and then hunt the others down once the main threat to the town is finished. The other nodded, and they both staggered as the ground trembled beneath them. The ground trembled and bucked, and the sucking, grinding roar of sand poured past them at great speed into the hole, causing deep cracking sounds to reverberate through the air. Suddenly, they felt as though they were caught in a dreadful combination of an earthquake and a vortex. It felt like being caught in a riptide a few meters away, but fortunately it hadn't hit them so hard. Then, from the center of the hole, a real geyser of sand, not water, erupted, swept several dozen meters over their heads, and crashed back down around the perimeter. The ground beneath their feet pulled forward into the hole, and the sand at their knees pulled them back. The dust and particles in the air from this madman made it hard to sense the other 4 Jedi Knights, and all they could do was maintain their ground. It was hard enough to follow Akana in the Force. The shore. "Darkness is taking over everything," exclaimed the other man. "Get moving," he yelled over the deafening din. "Don't get too close." The second headmaster, his heart racing and his ears ringing, quickly hid his lightsaber in his robes, hoping to get to higher ground, but as soon as he let go of his left foot and tried to steady himself on the sand, something jumped out and seized him. He tightened his teeth and struggled with both hands to hold something solid, but he kept sliding because there was nothing to brace him. The second headmaster pushed it down as he felt a sudden terror as more and more of the earth seemed to be slipping away from him. Something wrapped up his left leg against his will, too intense and determined to be his head playing with the sand, but it was a lovely relief when Akana's hand flew out to clasp his right wrist. The second headmaster's eyes opened, his whole body braced on the ground, his eyelids clenched hard against particles as he understood that the redhead had fallen so far into the sand pit that Akana could not have reached him without hitting the earth. Another tendril crawled up his right leg, and he let go with his left hand, gripping Akana's wrist fiercely, but a cautious cut through them did no good, for the wretched creatures were nothing more than sand, and they instantly regrouped as he reached for his lightsaber and rekindled it. With a curse, he pushed his weapon aside and used his primitive telekinesis to strike out. The man's strength was in detail work, and he was already exhausted when he tried to climb again, but Akana was using his ability to brace himself against the shaky ground and get traction to pull without sinking with far greater success. The second headmaster knew, with a sinking stomach, that although it wasn't aimed at him, he would exhaust himself before he could escape the sucking maelstrom, even as he fought desperately for the surface and away from this dark, sapient sand. For a brief time, everything seemed to slow down for him: the grasping tendrils, the rushing sand, the darkness above and around them, the sticky, deeper darkness of the drones fleeing, the sweaty feel of Akana's wrist beneath his fingers, the muffled sound of his heartbeat pounding in his ears. He let go of all the fear and lingering anger into the Force with a slow, deep breath as his anxieties faded beneath his decision. "It has been an honor to grow and live alongside you, First Headmaster, my friends," he thought, sending his message through the Force. The second headmaster turned back to Akana, his crimson eyes concentrated and serene despite the tight sand around his chest and waist. His words were, "I'm sorry, Sandmen." Then he broke Akana's wrist bones as he went under. Lucid dreaming is possibly the most pointless skill Madara has wasted time mastering. As the dream shifted suddenly from flaming fields of molten rock and gushing lava bubbles to muddy, unattractive plains afflicted by a ferocious, howling tornado that roared and raged without even making his hair flutter, he groaned in frustration, rubbed his hair, and stared at the futile landscape. Madara plugged his ears firmly against the roaring noise and looked around in the hazy hope that something familiar would appear, wondering what the Sith-damned purpose of dream visions was if they were worthless. At this point, the only thing that had happened as a result of following Makoto's advice was that he was even better at remembering how annoying everything was when he woke up. When Madara reflexively tried to activate his eyes 2 months ago, the Sharingan combined all the elements of the dream sequence into a single scene, slammed more noise, color, sound, and force impressions into Madara's brain than anyone could possibly handle, and made him jump up and throw up, all of which contradicted Izuna's assertion that the Sharingan couldn't be used during dreams. It was extremely unfair to spend 3 days feeling as if you had sustained a terrible concussion without even having the excuse of being in a fight to support it. "Here we have our scheduled switch from Tornado Planet to the pitch-black planet of giant trees," Madara said, drawing, yes, as the scene disappeared, the colors fading like water down a drain. It was a damp world, almost exactly as he had described it, with enormous trees that were many times bigger than anything he had ever seen. This could have been a sign of identification in and of itself, but the only reason he knew they existed was because he had stepped into a trunk in many of his previous dreams. If Madara had any faith in his force-damned luck, it would be to find the lone colony of parasitic or deadly moss in an otherwise harmless acre of forest. He was literally unable to see the hand in front of his face, and since sight was the Uchiha's inherited strength, he could not identify plants by touch. Additionally, tree bark wasn't harmful unless it was covered in moss, in which case it was moss-covered bark. He didn't want bioluminescent skittering creatures that sent off every danger sense he had honed over decades of risky behavior, especially when they pursued him over many kilometers for what felt like hours, and he could see even more clearly that they were intelligent enough that it was no accident that they led him to other things that attempted to kill him. However, Madara had several reasons to frantically withdraw all of his complaints about wanting light in favor of being incredibly, fucking explicit about yearning for sunlight. All of this occurred in a gloomy setting. That raised a lot of worries. Fugaku and Izuna would constantly remind him of it in a demeaning way, only because Makoto was kind enough to admit that he had truly freaked out. She still hadn't forgiven him for using force lightning to burn her hardwood floor during his outburst over a stick insect last month, and cruel enough to refuse to share the blackmail. "Why do all the people I care about behave so badly?" he said out loud, side-eyeing the black void, as something invisible skittered along the ground to his left. "If everyone you know is a jerk, then the only thing they have in common is you. Aren't you the friendliest sentient being on this side of the core?" Madara sprung back, his muscles loosening as the half-sensed form lay at his back, unseen. The person at his back, a humanoid, possibly male, Madara had previously assumed had solidified over the past few weeks, despite the fact that the vision itself had expanded and included more hazy elements, such as a silent firefight and an ancient building that was falling to ruins and reeking with the feel of death, fear, and bewildered confusion. It was comforting to have someone by his side through it all, even if all he could see of them was a blurry image of a hooded figure slogging through old books, real books, as Madara shuffled between shelves in a transparent, foggy repository. A high-pitched buzz sliced through the air behind him, and he heard something enormous howl as it thudded to the ground. "Relax, Madara," he heard, "and we will find it, and we will mend things. We haven't discovered it yet, but there's always a route to the future." As the dirt turned into a man-made pathway that hung over countless kilometers of vast space, he patted his muscular back and muttered, "I bet you got an A+ in fortune cookie comfort. Did they teach you that, too?" Madara smiled and let out a quiet sigh of annoyance. "Don't buy those, you fool, they're poisonous." "I don't know what those are, but you can be certain you're being stupid." "They're orange, not green, they're," Madara shot back, losing his sense of reality as he became more engrossed in the picture. "What are we doing? Who are you? Do you know?" The air turned crimson with the stench of refiltered air, a red, ominous light appeared behind Madara, a voice whispered impatiently, "Waiting," and a heavy presence fell upon them both as if they were being watched. "Yes, but what is the reason?" His demand was, "What must we do? Is it impossible to ask, can you help me?" "By that, what do you mean?" "It's all for naught if you arrive late." As soon as he saw movement, Madara turned to grasp the other, but the heat rising from above and the fierce wind blowing sand in his face startled him. "Done, done, done, da-dadden, da-done." Madara woke up and thrashed on the edge of his bed, desperately gripping the fitted sheets when he heard brass instruments screaming close to his ear. However, gravity overtook him, and he fell to the ground in a tangle of tangled material and embarrassment. "Fails," he snarled. The droid beeped back to him in binary with a string of happy, sing-song sounds, then started blaring the Criffing March at full force. "Can you listen to me?" He snarled, craned his neck back, and shook a menacing finger at it with his left arm. "I will end you, Bumbles," he said. "I will force punch you into a wall, render you back to your component parts, and donate what's left of you to the clan's school for kids to practice on. Bumbles, what will you be doing? Bumbles! BB-03," he yelled. The shitty astromech rolled to a stop next to where his black hair had been spread out across the floor and gave a long, melancholy beep towards his upside-down face as the racket trailed into silence. Then it perked up and essentially went to attention, little antenna standing straight up and all the yellow circles on its black body rolled perfectly symmetrically. Bumbles reached out a small manipulator arm, picked up a tangled chunk of his hair, and carefully dropped it back down on his shoulder instead of the floor. With his left shoulder aching and his right knee still hidden beneath the covers, Madara just started pounding his fingers on the ground. Hissing, "That doesn't fix this." Then Bumbles seemed to sag, but Madara just swung his outstretched arm at its head, and it rolled out of the way, turned its sensor back onto his prone body, beeped thoughtfully, and then clicked its holocamera, followed by a droid equivalent of uncontrollably laughing and rolling around with excitement. "I warned you not to pay attention to Azuna. You have no line of shame in any part of your programming," he complained, lifting his head and slamming it to the floor. "They're not amusing." Bumble stopped, shook its head rapidly, and gave a deep brrrrrrr. "No," Madara said slowly, "no, they are not. I will reprogram your ass and throw Azuna into the waterfall hogtied if this happens again, just watch me." The robot responded with a loud, abrupt SNNT. Madara groaned as he pulled the last of the blankets from the bed, rolled over, and curled into a ball on the ground. "What do you even want?" he asked. His body was screaming for more sleep, but his mind was not playing along. He bitched, trying unsuccessfully to convince his body that, despite the fact that the metal floor beneath his cheek wasn't as comfortable as the bed, it was still a good place to sleep. Now that he had seen the vision once tonight, it was much more seductive since he might actually nod off. Sadly, he had to contend with adrenaline and loud droids. When Madara heard a few happy beeps, he stretched out from the blankets and tossed his pillow at the wretched monster. "Once we arrived, I instructed you to wait until I woke up. Don't wake me up when we arrive, you future scrap metal ball. You understood me perfectly. Describe one amazing instance where I relished being awakened early." Madara could see that the little brat had twisted its body suggestively back and forth without even taking off his head. The pitch of Bumbles varied smoothly. "Go, move the ship onto the Rima trade route so the Ariadjuans don't think we've broken down or something," he commanded. "Get out of here, you voyeuristic, annoying malfunction." Flipping out its welding flame vertically, it wheeled off happily. Madara had never been able to tell if the droid was trying to be cute and give him the thumbs up or if it was just a means of kicking him off with joy. Despite the lack of evidence to support either assertion, Madara declined to investigate the situation for two reasons. As a sure way to finish things badly, Bumbles would first have to admit that he wasn't always able to understand it. Madara was not suggesting that Bumbles had not yet considered sending him out. Madara moaned, beckoned with a crooked finger, and returned his pillow to him. The man said, "I should just rename it Little Shit. That was a terrible idea, of course." He would unintentionally call Bumbles that aloud the following time he went back to the clan, which would immediately annoy all the local parents. It was absurd that even Fugaku would give his youngest the scowl of disapproval, since he was out in the galaxy someplace attempting to make something of himself after escaping at the age of 10, just like the theatrical brat he surely still was. Madara was by no means the worst influence in life, as seen by the fact that he had little to do with the weird messies he called nephews. Bumbles' little trick startled him up a few hours into his scheduled sleep cycle, which was a little strange because the dream hadn't been abruptly interrupted. As soon as the pillow was within reach, he reached for it, fell onto his back, and pushed it beneath his head. His body pleaded for sleep, but the dull ceiling was not enough to lull him back. He had to go the extra step of recording everything and mailing it home to be included to the archives because the clan could not readily record things that were subjective or just exhibited less frequently. The last thing Fugaku wanted was for inquisitive family members to formulate hypotheses about what was going on and offer them to him every 5 minutes, so at least he was following Madara's directive that everything be sealed until this was somehow handled. Even though they wouldn't have freely disclosed anything to someone who didn't share their ideas, it would still have existed. Overcoming a librarian's stubbornness is far simpler than attempting to reconcile contradicting information and hoping it's true. If only we had better resources, Madara thought sourly as he recalled all the evidence he had discovered to back up the old Jedi stories. He rubbed both palms down his cheeks and muttered a complaint. It had taken him 3 more months to decide if the documents from Alderaan or Naboo were accurate the last time he had found contradicting historical facts about Alderaan. The Naboo paperwork was likely intact, which was reassuring, but it was inconvenient to learn that the Naboo records matched their obituaries, as this implied that Alderaan had been tampered with before. Either someone handled the publicity, there had been cover-ups, or it was a component of the early decades' impulsive lash-out reaction. He collected and analyzed a great deal of information, but he still didn't fully grasp the hows, whys, and whos if there was a who at all. Although he had gigabytes of data and holobooks that supported his educated estimates about what was going on and the approximate time and location of the start, none of it provided him with a strategy for what to do next. He stared at nothing and bitched to himself. "So tiring," he remarked. As he raised his left hand and stared blankly at the faded wounds from the Ilum crystal splintering all over his palm, his face became blank. He thought, "I don't have any way to fix it," and he said, "There's still no way to do anything about it all." Madara shakily breathed in and out and massaged the heel of his palms against his burning eyes, but his pitiful attempts to relax and let go only mirrored his own agony. It felt like a thick, dark blanket of moist force enveloping him. "I haven't been back in a while, but even while it annoys me to feel like I've stopped again, I genuinely enjoy the sense of calm and closeness." He rolled onto his side once more, thinking, perhaps I should go home for a break. "We'll stop after this," he replied, balancing the force and slowing his breathing with the help of an unnamed entity behind him. "We'll check out this one last oddity and then go back home, regroup, restock," he murmured, "figured out another place to check, get some fresh eyes to look it over maybe," he said. "Madara, please settle down. We'll find it and fix it." Madara thought of their firm decision and assurance, and hoped they were correct. Perhaps he could fulfill his vow if the Fanged One chooses to ignore him or even assist him in navigating this mess they're all in once the winged goddess grants him her favor. At that point, of course, the ship's intercom started playing the carking march again, with a metallic screech that had not been audible the previous day. He could have to do all of this without his droid because he was going to kill Bumbles. Getting dressed hadn't given him enough time to sort through the many options that sounded appealing at the moment, so he hadn't decided exactly how he wanted to get rid of the annoying menace when Madara stormed into the cockpit, boots clicking against the floor as he shoved his left arm into his white, hooded longcoat. There was always the option to start alphabetically, wait for its memory to re-upload to one of the backup bodies, and then move on to the next method on the list, but Madara wasn't sure he cared about it at the moment. But that sounded like a lot of money and travel time, and it seemed like a poor precedent to set for someone with his short fuse. The tiny thermos of freshly brewed coffee that was waiting on his seat astounded him. He opened the container and took a tiny sample of the deliciously hot tea, unfazed by the customary sight of blood pouring into Madara's eyes. Madara gave Bumbles a threatening side-eye as she took it up and sat down in the seat after staring at it for a few seconds. The droid beeped encouragingly and its sensor shutters flickered adorably for a few microseconds. He swallowed. "You hear me? You get to live another day," he said. Madara was a man of his word and not a weak-spined sentient who made pointless threats, so it wasn't that he didn't mean it when he swore he would kill the robot. Bumbles beeped happily and carefully avoided bringing up the current tally of how many times Madara had stated it. Leaning back in his chair and taking another sip of coffee, he grumbled. "Oh, fuck it," he murmured. The first responders had already concluded that the crash in the Rima trade route an hour ago was caused by an asteroid going into the route, which was, to put it mildly, odd, because there were no asteroids or other celestial bodies in the region. The Ariadu was sending a high-priority message to every ship that had fallen out of hyperspace due to the collision. As soon as he completed his first thermos and picked up the second one that Bumbles had prepared, the droid started reporting. At least they could cross that off their list for this week because Bumbles had taken the trouble to look for all available astronavigation updates rather than just the pertinent one close by.
After checking the datapad's readings, Madara remarked, "You could have just gone ahead and updated the NAV computer without waking me up." Madara gave a few low-pitched pings and snorted in silence.
You pick the most ridiculous times to refrain from initiative, you hardly have trouble presuming on a host of other topics, and it's not like you actually waited before updating today.
Madara let out a yawn, loosened his shoulders, and broke many vertebrae.
At least they wouldn't have to speak to the video screen anytime soon, even though his hair was still a tangled mess. Moreover, if he had pulled the mass through a hair tie twice to form a loose bun, it would have appeared less electrified hedgehog and more on purpose. It doesn't look like anything vital for the next week or so, but after that I might have to start resorting to the ration bars, he replied, perusing the inventory list on the screens.
We're running low on a few essentials. The bumbles landed theatrically sideways.
Precisely, let's avoid that. They're healthy, but that's all they have going for them, and I've already eaten more of them in one lifetime than any being should have to suffer through. Fuel looks okay, money looks okay, no emergency updates needed, no emergency repairs needed. Let's go ahead and schedule the secondary updates for when we're next planetside somewhere with a strong subspace network. Holonet access would be faster if you can get it without breaking laws for a reasonable price, but I don't think anything on here is specialized enough that a regional network wouldn't have it anyway. Also, keep an eye on the minor repair areas on our to-do list. Go ahead and triage them for potential severity, and then look up the areas that have those parts for cheapest. We'll hit them as they become available if they're nearby. After taking it, Bumbles inquired a questioning trill. His hair was pulled back, and he scowled at the astromech. No, we're not stopping on Ariadu, he mumbled. First of all, I hate this planet, second, I hate these people, and third, it will be cheaper to stop somewhere else and buy goods later because food is one of their main imports. If not, we can always pick a planet and I'll find anything.
Don't even. It simply beeped binary and tilted its head.
Yes, you were, he replied.
And before the jump, is there anything else we should talk about? Lights flared on Bumble's helmet, projecting a translucent blue hologram of the nearby galaxy into the air.
Again, as he reached into a nearby container, he arched an eyebrow at the robot and remarked, "No, it's fine, knock it off. It's not like our destination doesn't impact you, and it is a bit weird this time."
Madara shook his hand dismissively.
He held the old piece of paper he had gotten on a low-tech world years ago in front of his face before closing his eyes.
All right, go for it.
There was no sign of the map, and when Madara heard Bumble's beep and saw the droid's repulsor lift activate while it hovered and shifted slightly, his eyes flushed once more. In some respects, it was far simpler to just feel the force and trust his gut than to look at it and attempt to understand its currents. Most of the objects were protected from light by the paper, but the Sharingan could still feel force currents flowing through them. Depending on his focus and his search, it often appeared as a solid background in space with eddies, currents, and hundreds of nuances. But using both was considerably more accurate.
Madara, still watching the force, went for the rear of his holopad and unclipped the pad's pen.
His focus on their next location made the force respond to his own potential futures, even if the hologram on the map was only insubstantial light and had no effect on the force itself. There were tumultuous bubbles of potential disaster and swirls of interest. By merely concentrating on one area, the other force currents on the map underwent a complete transformation, shivering and squirming as though their foundations were shaky. Madara threw the stylus like a dart through the area where the force was splintered like glass that had shattered on the ground and been reglued in place, even though he knew that difficulties would occur if they went there, just as he knew his own name. He had seen so few force locations with that kind of announced conclusion, so they had to get there regardless of the danger.
Madara drops the paper, and Bumbles gazes ambivalently at the blinking dot on the droid's map. Looks like we're still heading to Utapau then.
Bumbles shouted in rage and beeped shrilly as he rolled forward to ram the starport official's knees.
With a frown, Madara took hold of Bumbles and used the force to drag it to his side.
The short translation of that is bullshit if you didn't catch it all, he responded. Now try again because the port fees sure as hell didn't cost that much when I checked your net, he said. The sentient's face did not change, but the taller Powan, staring at the robot Madara still held, narrowed its red-socketed eyes down at him. There was a moment of subdued amazement in the force as Madara flashed the Sharingan back at the sentient. His creased gray skin moving, he gave Madara what was clearly intended to be a smile before turning back to the holopad in his hands. It was helpful to be able to refute people's initial assumptions about you when they assume you're human, because people don't always get along with animals that don't meet human stereotypes. Additionally, it prevents them from simply copying and pasting their ideas about you. The Powan's basic opinion of Madara as an insolent child persisted, but at least he had guided the man from impending hostility into reluctant displeasure. His blaster and electrostaff weren't always the best option, even though they were designed to endure unpleasant reactions. The figures listed on Pao City's website are out of date and haven't been properly updated since the last Offworlder came through. What I quoted you is indeed the current fee in galactic credits, stated the official. A spaceport with a low level of service is not a desolate wasteland, and nothing in the last few weeks points to an economic catastrophe. That's ridiculous, he whispered, and poked Bumbles with the edge of his boot as it started to advance once more. Even though the Red Merlin is a small passenger plane rather than a cargo plane, it shouldn't be half that high. Official Taiyan MiOMG said, "Be that as it may, the fee is what it is. Given the site's false display, I can make an adjustment between the two numbers, but I cannot honor such a low rate in credits right now." He flicked the pad with the backs of his fingers. Observing the accidental focus, Madara asked, "How about Whoopie Yoopie? Or Druggets? In the credits?" Madara's head was still lowered, but I paused and gave him a serious glance. Feeling that his argument was well supported, he asked, "Isn't that the problem? The price shouldn't be converted into Republic credits since something happened and it ricocheted and dropped the exchange rate between currencies in the Outer Rim systems again. How much does it start at in each of the currencies you take?" They saw a burst overhead just as MiOMG was going to reply, and his body language shifted as he straightened. They were on the west side of the massive whole of Pao City, and it was simple to look up at the sky over the rocky eastern wall because this spaceport was located on the edge of the second stratum below. Whatever it was a sight to behold, splintering the sky with red crackles of lightning that raged across the horizon, black wisps of light that spat out like charred mist, and orange forks that seared across the blue sky, leaving behind afterimages of a great storm that had been stripped of all liquid and trapped on the ground so that it could only rage upward at the skies. It is the largest thing Madara has ever seen in the Force. Madara bowed and staggered into Bumbles at the sudden pressure, which came suddenly, without warning, and without any hint beforehand. Power, planetfuls of power condensed, burning, and flaringly chaotic, bucked and writhed across the surface to the east, and it metaphysically slammed into everything around it with the force of an asteroid crashing. It was like losing gravity when it suddenly vanished. The Powan jerked his head away with the slow, jerky unawareness of a force-blind being who had been hit hard with a mental effect and didn't recognize it, while official MiOMG stared at the now empty sky and Madara braced himself against one of his ship's landing struts, popping his ears and flexing his mental shields cautiously while pressing his hand into his hair and applying pressure to his throbbing temple. "Yes, we were discussing the fees in Whoopie Yoopie," the man replied, staring blankly at his notebook. Madara began to speak, but he quickly changed his mind as he considered the increasing blankness and vagueness that were encroaching on the force of the city. As he turned to face the Merlin's open entry ramp and walked past it to the cargo lift that was lowering, he asked. Madara flinched at the thud his poor bike made as it landed on the lift, but his brain felt almost half-numb from overstimulation, which apparently translated into an abrupt decrease in finesse. Another tug of force caused his speeder to slide over in the ship with a screech to drop down through the opening. The official stated, "They aren't commonly utilized on Utapau. The Varictils and Dactylians are the primary form of transport in city," as Bumbles started beeping shrilly at the side of the bike as he slowly recovered consciousness. Madara prepared the bike and made sure the bike compartment was locked just in case. "Errors. Sort out the payment with the port and then stick with the ship just in case. I'm going to check it out," he replied, cutting off the robot's grumbles. He mounted the bike, put on the gloves, put on the helmet, and kept the calm on just as Bumbles was ready to launch into another round of scathing condemnation of his life choices and sense of preservation. "What precisely are you doing, in your opinion?" Tien Me OMG objected, opting to go back to normal in that unpleasant situation. After he turned the bike on, he said, "My astromech, BB-03, has access to our funds and negotiation rights. It'll handle payment while I'm away. It's not designed to travel more than a few kilometers without forward momentum," I objected, surprised. "Kaluta's F-29 swoop is that. You can't use it fast enough in the sinkhole without crashing." "Maybe you can't," he scoffed mockingly before flipping a button to elevate the bike and turning to face Bumbles, who gave him a somber salute. He sped off the landing pad, angled along the sinkhole walls while the swoop warmed up, and then swung and twisted the bike into a barrel roll to climb vertically along the rock wall, clinging to the bike with more strength than was natural to him, ignoring the blaring sensation of crazy near human coming from the Powan. He twisted sideways after increasing the speed for a few precious seconds, and as soon as he reached the minimum speed requirement, he shot across the open bowl of the city. Madara swerved around a bend, away from the lowering sun, and threw an inverted corkscrew before heading east out of Pao City. The second headmaster expected to perish in the sand. Regardless of their strength, Jedis have always been more mortal than rumors suggest, and the second headmaster was no exception, as he had thought that letting go of Akana would be the end of him. 1 cubic meter of sand weighed more than a ton, and there was a lot more sand in this darkened death trap than that. But that's not precisely what happened. Instinct had him hold his breath and shield his eyes from the jagged grains as the sand whirled about him, but his hindbrain cried out for one more instant of life rather than the darkness and sand engulfing him like a rat stuck in a garbage crusher. Even years later, he would never be able to fully explain what had happened next. The force sparked and buffeted around him, the sand guiding rather than dragging, and instead of being dragged down, he was free-falling through an intangible nothingness as the darkness in the sand blazed into power like an inverse star, horribly and paradoxically bright in his senses and through his eyelids. Even the most composed master would have been alarmed if they had been present. There was a sense of falling but no movement, no oxygen but no suffocation, and the second headmaster clamped down on his serenity with grim resolve. He plummeted through the knot space, the heat of fire, the chill of death, and a blurry mist, regaining his course with a reassuring push of hard sand before crashing into a turbulent sea of rough waves. He felt the compressed water take him down in a damp-free vortex, but the darkness was different and stronger, deeper and wider, like an enveloping envelopment waiting in the distance. He shouted and blew out the bottom of the sucking pressure as reality collapsed around him. The boiling updraft of steam that buffeted him skyward was positively heavenly in comparison to the terrible sunfire of heat that burned away every sensation of his body in its inferno as he simply struggled to hold his presence together, no matter how oppressive the indomitable presence in the force became. He drowsily tried to track his body again using the thick sludge that somehow sank down his throat like mud down a drainpipe, ignoring the sensation that his stomach was rising in the sphere he was in as it seemed to slide along tracks, going airborne and spinning and reconnecting and shifting like a ride no amusement park could dare meet, not without the aid of the darkness that strengthened every stronger around him, radiating a gleeful, defiant freedom as it soared through every inch of space he knew. He was just starting to understand the feeling of his fingers flexing when it all broke. Tar and insanity extended out with insubstantial fingers to devour its winged prey, and as it fell, so did he. The globe was dragged by cloying, insatiable hunger, and his terror, rage, and hatred tore through him. The soaring dark shouted without voice, scorching like rebar into his mind. As he fell, reality broke apart all around him, and the pain and darkness were nothing compared to the emptiness that lay between the world's cracks, a void of nothingness, energy, and power of nature that, if the transition didn't tear him apart first, would kill him like space kills any human. The inky tentacles of darkness, solid as duracrete and untouchable as storm clouds, grasped for him, and even he could not decide whether it was better to die in the void or to be saved by this dark. He could never surrender to the dark side and be himself in this place outside of all places, where there was only warring darkness as deep and distinct as human hearts. Would his death be interpreted as resistance or complicity? He felt a searing scarlet that seethed of rebellious malice as it seized him violently, causing him to experience blistering anguish and physical pain, but instead the tentacle crashed into him, slamming his ribs and sending him flying, away from the living tar that was cannibalizing that shrieking, winged fury.
Teeth larger than temples are tucked inside a reddish-orange nova.
Do your duty, Jedi. It was almost more surprising that he had woken up at all than the smooth, powdery earth under his face. The world made sense again, and light was everywhere, gently dispelling the lingering feel of the dark side, and the second headmaster moaned feebly and just lay there, not caring that the ground smelled faintly of ozone, that there were hints of darkness lingering all around him, that not even the pounding rawness inside his mind could take away the peaceful calm he found in the light side at this moment. But it was overpowered by the hazy sense of a dark sider coming. He was already at a disadvantage if this turned into a fight because he could not move due to doubled and blurred vision, and his left arm, which was trapped beneath his body, felt fine, if numb, but his shoulder was a raw, hot spot of pain that seemed to radiate all the way down to his scapula. When he attempted to shift off his arm, he stopped and just breathed while he tried to control it. The vertebrae. The second headmaster's breath seized in his chest, and he held it until he was able to wiggle both feet's toes slowly, if painfully. He pulled his arms out from under him and let his weight gradually shift to the front of his right shoulder. The damage is severe and I can't feel parts of it except when I try to move, which says nothing good, but at least the spinal cord seems intact, he remarked. I just have to trust the force that he didn't have any damaged vertebrae because he honestly couldn't feel it past everything else. With his lightsaber at his side, likely hidden by the substance he felt coating his hand, the second headmaster sat down once more and tried to concentrate on the monster approaching him. His senses felt as if they had been burned, so he could not tell how strong they were, but given that the individual did not seem to be projecting at all, it is possible that they were currently hiding most of their power if they were trying to approach while being underestimated. He knew full well that he wouldn't even be able to defeat a senior Padawan at this point, but he grimly reasoned that it wasn't necessary. His only chance would be to underestimate and launch a stealthy up-close attack, and all he would have to do was hope the Darksider wasn't too arrogant to bring a ranged weapon like a blaster. What they felt, however, was not so dark as the cloying thickness of smoke and the lurking edge of poison hidden in almonds, but rather like an explosive potential balanced on knife blades, ready to tear through obstacles with heartless rage, like a smoldering fire hidden in the forest litter beneath foot, ready to rage. A Sith might be able to, but they had been destroyed nearly 1,000 years ago, so second headmaster had no comparisons to make, though his standards might be seriously distorted given his recent experience. The force he had felt after sinking beneath the sand was unlike any rogue Jedi he had ever encountered, even under the most bizarre circumstances. But he wasn't certain. His goal was to stay alive until a fellow Jedi could reach him, not to heal everything. He wouldn't have time for that, so he calmed his breathing and tried to focus his healing energies on the most serious wound. It was quite unsettling that the energy gravitated instantly toward a wound near the top of his spine, but he decided to ignore it for the time being because there was nothing he could do about it other than focus on what he could do. If they could reach him in time, the gloomy surroundings he could see were nothing like what he remembered of Samaria. A few yards away, the second headmaster heard a speeder stop, and when he opened his eyes again, he saw a figure getting off the bike with a cylindrical object on their back, dark boots, a long, light-colored coat, and a mass of wild hair in a sloppy tie that fell out of their helmet when they took it off. The figure was starkly backlit by the last of the sun. He felt a heavy presence observing him, but he was careful not to get offended. A woman, he couldn't verify it with the Force, but their forward stride felt odd for a female of most species. He closed his eyes as they got closer and waited until he could sense them crouched a meter away. After a moment of hesitation, the second headmaster opened his foggy eyes. A human-looking man with light complexion, black hair, and slightly glinting red eyes. Red. The second headmaster hurried forward, sabotaged the man's neck, and did his best to bury the pain while muttering, Sith, blaming and cursing. However, he ducked, sidestepped, and blasted the second headmaster's blade within millimeters from his neck. When the second headmaster heard the ground thud behind him, he jumped sideways to avoid it, but as he landed, his left knee hurt badly. After landing in a crouch, the man sprung to his feet with greater speed, punching forward with his left hand and reaching behind him with his right. No, 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 he thought fiercely as his knee buckled. Not right now. He tried to move and straighten himself as he fell, but his head was already in the way of a black blur. There was a painful thump of metal against the man's skull as he fell. The white-haired man gave him a dubious look, so Madara dropped his electrostaff, rotated it to make sure he had a solid grasp, and then jabbed him firmly in the hollow between his neck and right shoulder, where he seemed unconscious but had done so before. Nothing happened. He mumbled, "Well, I suppose you're safer now," as he used his left hand to gently massage the lengthy scar behind his right jawline. He winced slightly at the slightest sign of a first-degree burn, and he nearly received a much more deadly addition to that scar today. He circled the man and whacked the metal grip away from the spot where it had broken loose from his extended hand. His red eyes were likely near human, and he was human, for starters. However, Madara vaguely recalled from biology that red was an uncommon gene, mutation, or something even in pure humans, so maybe the human option was still open. The man didn't look like he had struck mid-years for his life expectancy, and his white hair was odd given his apparent age. He stood out like a sore thumb on Utapau. Was it just another strange hue, or was it a powerful force presence that made him look younger than his actual age without affecting his hair? Due to Kriff's force abilities. Now that the commotion around him had subsided and the blow to his head had apparently shattered his shields, he shone bright in the force. He was in danger, but not in the sense of a primed grenade or an immediate threat, but rather as the bright, sharp gleam of light reflected off a sword with a sheath for when it wasn't needed. "Why are you here at all?" Looking at the two beige tunics, the utility belt, and the dark brown boots, he said out loud, "I'll bet my ship you weren't here before to that power outage." The boots were a great alternative for security and comfort in case you ever had to, for instance, fight on a dry landscape, but they wouldn't be something you would buy if you were low on funds. They were well made and sufficiently weathered to suggest continuous usage without being overdone. When one of his old shoes went out, Madara kind of wanted a black pair for himself. Even though there were no burns or holes in the clothing that would have indicated an accident or blaster fire, and the only redness was some spotting in the upper center of the left portion of his back, the redness should have been recent if the man's loss of balance had nothing to do with the boots. Peeping through 2 layers of tunics that looked heavy? After looking and rubbing the back of his skull, Madara complained and put the staff back in its magnetic clip on his back. Then he strode forward, knelt next to the man, and took off the outer tunic while taking a utility knife from his boots. He growled, "Sucks to be you, asshole," as he slashed through the collar's back and pulled the knife down. With a furious curse, Madara flung open the tunic and grabbed the communication device from his jacket's inner pocket. "Errors," he cried out, "get on the home database and find me somewhere nearby that knows how to treat probable humans beyond throwing Bacta on it and praying for the best," as he looked at the enormous traces of blood pouring through the inner tunic. "And get the ship over here now while you're at it," he yelled. Over the rolling metal, he heard a horrifying series of beeps, and Madara considered how dangerous it would be to pull the cloth up to see what was happening. As his hands progressively peeled up the fabric, he responded, shifting his awareness between flesh and material to look for anomalies. "No, I'm all right." Fortunately, nothing seemed to have dried sufficiently to stick to the fabric yet, or at least not fortunately, since it hadn't slowed down yet. "There's a large bleed somewhere on his back close to the spine. He fought so no nerve damage I think, but his knee gave out so there's something there too," he responded. Once the tunic was out of the way, he drew the knife through while holding the material steady with his hands, flinching at the sight. The man's entire torso was covered in long strips of damage, some of which overlapped at the top left to leave his shoulder almost entirely raw or blackened, and the base of his neck, where the spine protruded outward, was cracked open in the center of the burn, along with several other areas that were bleeding freely. He looked as though the rest of his back had been cauterized. He was careful not to say it aloud for Bumbles to hear, because he knew he would never be able to get the robot to play nice. "And here are several reasons why you shouldn't have tried to kill me," he said. As the spacecraft started to power up in the background, Madara rolled his eyes at what seemed to be a needless query. He is not sure where else to go because at least half of his back is burned. I want answers, but it's more difficult to acquire them from dead men. No, I didn't fight him, I didn't cause the wounds, and we're not just leaving him here. However, I believe he will need to be immersed in a Bacta tank. They are fairly expensive to install. Is there one on Earth, Utapau? One we could reach, he asked as he approached the bike, opened the compartment, and removed the small first aid bag he kept inside. Bumbles hummed doubtfully as the spaceship buzzed in the distance. With a frown, he dropped the equipment and tore up a Bacta patch as he hit the ground. Great, he muttered. He clenched his teeth and reached for a piece of sterile gauze as he noticed more blood accumulating around the wound. Madara ruthlessly ignored the man's reflexive jerk and used the Bacta patch to wipe the blood from his spinal wound. Sucks to be you, buddy, she muttered. Because his burns were too large for anything other than triage at this point, the man would just need to deal with the glue that was on them. After rinse and repeat cleaned the other open wounds on his back, he was just out of Bacta in the kit. Given how much the skin flexes there during movement, it was not surprising that only the knee had blood on the fabric next to it when he examined the remainder of the man. It would have blown up if he had also been burned there. He grabbed some rubber tubing from the kit and applied a tourniquet, at minimum, to the man's upper thigh. Instead of nailing him like the walking target he felt like, they could have transported him somewhere else before he passed out from shock or blood loss if the force had been with them. Unfortunately, there wasn't much surface water on this awful rock, which would have been useful. Madara frowned at the man's bleeding hands and put the cloth over his back once again to keep the cold out. They were the only ones available and should be put away for later, even if he really wanted to run a sterilizing wipe through his hair. He asked, "Do you have anything?" The robot gave a positive response and requested more details. "We're low on options, so no, I don't care if they're underground or unregistered. If a clansman marked them reliable, we don't have enough Bacta on board to do much, and I don't think we should dare to take too long in case there's a complication I'm missing. He's too aware. Trying to scan deeper might wake him up, which is not in the cards for several reasons. Yeah, just park nearby. I'll hover both him and the bike in and you can steer us there. I'll stay back with him since we don't have a good place to both keep him flat and secured in case of turbulence. See you in 5." Since they were unlikely to return anytime soon and Utapa's hyperwinds would destroy any evidence the first time they arrived, Madara immediately levered himself up and started using the Sharingan to perform a thorough scan of the surroundings. Even though it was much fainter than when he'd first stopped and got off, the force itself was still rolling and bubbling like storm clouds in the circular area with more powdered dirt where he'd originally seen the white-haired man. Thick streaks of remaining dark force suggested multiple high-level users with scores to settle had engaged in a knockdown, drag-out battle, yet there was no sign that anybody other than his assailant had been around. Hell, there were no footprints to indicate how the second man got to the circle's edge. The most peculiar of all is that, despite having been trained and remaining alive after your majority, you are burning on the light side of the force with no darkness at all. How on earth did you accomplish that? There aren't impact marks, so you didn't fall, Madara said, staring down at the individual. You weren't dropped out of a speeder. You have wounds that didn't damage your clothes, but nothing to suggest you put them on after the injury. He sneered at him again, turned to go, and gingerly picked up the man's gun from where he had placed it. It should not have been possible, yet it succeeded, leaving a faint thrum in the force and burns of proximity. It could not be, but it was obviously real. It almost took his head off. How is it possible for someone to possess a lightsaber?